Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish live from our Cowcaddon studio. I'm Erin Lux and today our guests are Murray Pittock, Professor of History at the University of Glasgow, and Natasha Meikle, Trustee of Scottish Women in Sport. Welcome, Natasha and Murray. So first of
Hello.
hello. So first of all, a coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. yesterday, there were 1,386 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 and 9 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. 4,022,914 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,305,325 have received their second dose. 359 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 41 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 353,299 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID-19. 7,992 patients who tested positive have sadly died. And in coronavirus news this week, it has been announced that we will be easing restrictions beyond level 0. This will mark an end of social distancing, a reintroduction of large-scale events, and nightclubs are to reopen, while indoor dining and schools will still require a mask. Also, the JCVI advice has changed on vaccinating 16 and 17-year-olds, and there are now walk-in clinics available for this age group. There will also be changes to self-isolation with people who have 2 doses of the vaccine no longer being required to self-isolate after being a close contact of a coronavirus case if they test negative on a PCR test. Murray, what do you think of these new changes to the coronavirus restrictions?
Well, clearly we're moving back towards normality, albeit slowly. We'll just have to see what happens. These things will have to come. Will have to come in conjunction with the mass vaccination for flu for over 50s and other vulnerable groups, which will start to be rolled out in September because of the fears, of course, not only of COVID, but of the fact that immune systems against other infections of the of a similar kind are being weakened. I think the question really is. It looks as if we're pulling through this, but we can't be absolutely sure yet. The question really is how much the post level restrictions can be realistically sustained. Test and trace is of course remaining, but I have to say for many onlookers, test and trace has become undermined through the emergence over the last 2 or 3 months of special categories of people, be they UEFA officials or politicians, who seem to be exempt from test and trace and exempt from quarantining. And the other issue is the move to vaccinate the whole population. And there again, I think that probably and arguably more could have been done to encourage the vaccination in the under 30s and 40s, by clearly incentivizing it, particularly in the connection of foreign travel. So there are areas around the edge here which may not altogether work, but clearly the direction of travel is very positive, and it's a brilliant thing that we're actually emerging from this at last.
Thank you. Natasha, with large-scale events returning, as someone with an interest in sport, what does this mean to you and for especially women in sport?
I think it's great. It's been a very difficult time for everyone, and it's great that there really does now seem to be light at the end of the tunnel. And for a lot of people, normality is getting back to the things that they love to do. And for a lot of people, that is going to sports stadiums and sports games. And I think that's particularly important for people's mental health and well-being as well, that these things are coming back. And for me especially, I'm looking forward to that element of normality returning. But it does seem sensible that we do keep some restrictions in place, particularly around masks and distancing, to provide some added protections. There's obviously risks to opening up society and sports stadiums, and it does have the risk that we could see higher positive cases. But we need to hope that this is offset by the positive impact of the vaccines. The vaccine rollout has been going relatively well in Scotland. I echo what Murray said in relation to the younger generation with the levels of uptake. But I hope that the level of vaccinations do help when things start to open up more, and we do see the benefit of that vaccine rollout. Of course, as Murray's identified as well, there's still some questions going forward. And I think that's particularly around the younger people being vaccinated, which will be important as we enter the new academic year, people starting to return to schools and universities. And of course, the other issue is around foreign travel. There are layers of complication and different countries having so many different rules and requirements. And that makes it difficult for people who are looking to get away. And I certainly don't blame anyone trying to get away and have a break after 18 months of incredible challenge, but that does bring its own difficulties in terms of cases rising, doesn't it?
I just want to pick up on what you said about education. Murray, you're a professor at the University of Glasgow. How do you feel about this move to vaccinate 16 and 17-year-olds? Obviously, 17-year-olds are one of the incoming cohorts for the university. And what do you think the universities can do to encourage vaccination among their students?
Well, I'm not informed in terms of we did access to vaccine
Yeah,
are
we
in the varying of they're into
we seem to have lost Murray. The sound seems to have cut out. Yeah.
yes,
Natasha, do you have any thing to add about the sort
Yeah,
of the younger generations?
I think we need to make it insensitise them. I think that's true. I know many people who have been involved in the vaccine rollout, and they said when they were in these centres, when it was the over 60s, the over 50s, the queues were all the way around the block. And now that we're getting to the younger generation, these vaccine centres are unfortunately very empty. There's a lot of young people not turning up to their appointments. So I think that the idea of walk-in centres is going to be very important. We've seen sports stadiums have walk-in centres before games, and I think that's a very good idea for the sort of younger generation who may be going to the sports centres, maybe going to some of these venues. Let's have more walk-in centres so that they can pop in and get the vaccine on their way to something. I think we need to make it as easy as possible for people to get the vaccine. And the more people that have it, obviously the benefits the wider society will see. But having younger people have the vaccine is something that needs addressed. For me, one of the sort of main ways of being able to do this is encourage, vaccination status will help with foreign travel, with entry to sports stadiums. It's things like that, I think, that will encourage the younger people to get the vaccine, because there's certainly a school of thought amongst them that says, why do I need it? I'll be fine. And we need to address that, and we need to really educate on why the vaccine rollout is beneficial for wider society. It means we need them to get it as well, and we need them to sign up to it.
Thank you. Sorry, we lost you there for a minute, Murray. If we can.
That's right. I hope you got me back now. I mean, I don't want to prolong discussion of the same issues. I mean, I think what Natasha has got a great deal of sense. What I think myself is that the failure to link double vaccination to foreign travel and to incentivize people, make it easier to travel abroad through a link with vaccination has been a real missed opportunity for engaging younger age groups, and some indeed possibly of the older refuseniks, of whom there are more than a few in certain communities in our society. So I think that we haven't incentivized young people enough. Walk-in centres, absolutely. We're encouraging people and providing those provisions. And indeed, the fact universities are going to open up as much as they can or feel able to, but lectures are still largely in most institutions going to be online. And that's an issue which has recently hit the news, and some people are concerned about it. But really, when it comes to groups of 500 or 600 people, there are significant risks, especially if the ventilation systems in different buildings and different higher education institutions in big lecture theatres are not set up to deal with the kind of risk that might exist among a still significantly unvaccinated group. However, face-to-face teaching is going to come back for small groups across a lot of universities. That's quite a general move, and that's very positive because people learn best in many ways in small groups.
Excellent. Thank you. Moving on to our next story. In Afghanistan, as U.S. forces have pulled out, the Taliban has seized two cities that were provincial capitals, while Herat is under siege, and the people in Kabul fear encroachment from the Taliban. The U.S. forces' rapid withdrawal has increased instability and created a power vacuum. 20 years on from the invasion of Afghanistan by forces from a number of countries, the UK included, there seems to be not much progress having been made in terms of the return of the Taliban. Natasha, what does this mean for women in Afghanistan?
It's going to make things more difficult for them, isn't it? This has been an issue for the people of Afghanistan for centuries, really. We've seen in the past the Soviet Union, the USA, and to an extent Western Europe try to implement their solutions on the country only to become immersed in an ongoing conflict with no resolution and no end. And it seems to have been a cyclical experience. We see an external country drawn deeper and deeper into the issues until the point where, as we've seen, for a variety of reasons, the country decides to withdraw their military presence, and very quickly Afghanistan returns to a form of civil war. But the constant in all this is that millions of Afghans continue to struggle, live in danger, and that's the travesty of it all. Already we're hearing reports that the laws that have been put in place to protect women in Afghanistan are being disregarded so quickly after this change. And it's so sad to see, and for some reason it just doesn't seem to be achieving anything other than this cycle of ongoing conflict that is only making their lives more of a struggle.
Thank you. Murray, with the U.S., UK, and other countries together having been the force that invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and having sort of set up the government that exists there, do we owe something to them that this rapid withdrawal has failed to deliver, or were we perpetuating sort of a forever war?
Well, I think obviously that war expelled the Taliban from power, but didn't expel them from all their strongholds, and that's why the low-level fighting has continued ever since. I think one of the things about history, which is important to bear in mind, it doesn't just tell you what happened; it can actually tell you what's going to happen. And one of the things we're seeing now is very similar, though, with important differences to what happened in South Vietnam in 1973 to 75, to what happened with the early victories of Islamic State in Iraq a few years ago. You're seeing that the withdrawal of a government largely propped up by Western military power leads almost immediately to conflict and chaos, because really there's a large groups of people, and particularly those with a strong ideological Islamist bent in the case of Islamic State and the Taliban, who are geared to really stop at nothing to take over the institutions of the state, now that they are only defended effectively by forces armed but not untrained, but not actually backed by Western troops. So it's an extremely difficult situation, as Afghanistan has long been. And the issue, however, if the Taliban actually do succeed in taking over the whole country, as indeed looks reasonably likely, though as yet not certain, one can't altogether rule out some form of interest, military or otherwise, being taken by the Russian Federation. The one party who's been absent from Afghanistan in the last 20 years was very much present in the 20 years before that. So we're seeing this appalling cycle where in the 1980s and 90s, the US armed the Taliban to throw out the Soviets, and then the Taliban take over, and then the Taliban are expelled by the American-led coalition, and now they're coming back, and who knows if the Russian Federation won't come back too. Not a very pleasant situation, and not for the first time in Afghanistan.
Thank you. There's also been news out of Afghanistan about the plight of the translators and interpreters who have worked with UK and US forces and who have struggled to get to safety or to be given visas to arrive in the US or Canada or the UK. Would either of you like to comment on our refugee policy and our policy for helping the people who helped us in Afghanistan?
We don't, not for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to our next story, there are currently fires raging across Greece that are approaching Athens and devastating island and seaside communities. This follows on the flooding in Germany and Belgium that killed over 180 people and the devastating heat waves in North America, as well as warnings this week about instability in the systems that support the Gulf Stream, as well as the Amazon rainforest emitting more carbon than it absorbs. With COP26 coming up in Glasgow, climate change is obviously a topic of immediate discussion. And there have, of course, been recent controversies over the Scottish government continuing to pursue oil exploration. Natasha, what do you think of the situation in Greece just now?
The latest images we're seeing of a country in flames is displaying the reality of climate change again in a horrific way. And it feels like more and more often we're seeing towns, houses, lives decimated by wildfires, and it's heartbreaking. Greece is now on its 10th day of unprecedented heatwave, worse than they've had in 30 years. And this is becoming all too regular an occurrence. We're hearing stories like this and we're seeing the images that we're seeing. And the effects of climate change are everywhere. The frequency and strengths of these storms is increasing. The droughts and the floods are increasing. I think that the planet in general are far too guilty of burying our heads in the sand when it comes to the serious consequences, and that future generations are going to suffer as a result. And yes, while there are solutions for individuals in terms of climate change, we can change the way we eat, we can change our individual emissions, we can recycle. But if we're going to address these serious consequences, real change needs to happen at a government level. For example, without government planning and resourcing, we can't end our reliance on fossil fuels. We can't switch to renewable energy. If we want to limit the individual's use of private cars, we need better public transport in place. And we're not seeing that. So this needs to happen at a government level. And there's no reason that the Scottish government can't lead on this. We can lead and inspire stronger action worldwide, particularly given that we're hosting the International Climate Conference in Glasgow later the year.
Yes, thank you, Natasha. Murray, sometimes questions are asked about effective communication about the science of climate change. And as an academic, what do you think can be done to improve communication with the public and government about what is happening with climate change?
Well, there are about two or three things here. First of all, I think it is improving, but I think there was a very long time, too long a time, when major broadcasters, media discussion focused on the idea of balance. And the idea of balance was to put somebody who didn't know anything about it but didn't believe in it against somebody who knew a lot about it and knew it was happening. And that's not balance. So fundamentally, we went through a number of years where the idea that climate change was happening was an opinion held by some scientists, whereas in fact, what was not properly represented was it's a general consensus. We're moving away from that now, but there are two problems still. The first is, and of course I agree with Natasha that the Scottish government could do a lot, but I think we need to give credit. The Scottish government is doing a lot. The target originally set in 2009 and subsequently updated a couple of years later to be 100% domestically supplied by renewables in 2020 was all but hit at 99.4% last year. And Scotland has been regarded from the Copenhagen COP onwards as a leader in global climate change. Obviously, it's 5 million people, 5.5 million people. It's not a big deal. but I think we need to give ourselves credit, and that not just Scotland, but anybody who's providing a good example should be given credit. And we need to call out that the credit about governments that are doing well, and to have a much more international perspective than just asking politicians about what they'd like to do or what their targets are. Look at the good practice. So that's, I think, really important for communication. The third thing is to think laterally. I mean, I don't want to make this a discussion about something other than you've asked, but one of the consequences of Global Britain as a brand is that it involves large amounts of goods, and presumably, though that will be interesting to see if it's possible, services traveling very large distances using, frankly, carbon-derived fuel sources. There is a countervailing movement, not just from the point of view of European trading relationships, but in terms of local provenance, which has come to the fore more and more in the pandemic, where people have been concerned about the sustainability of global supply chains. And we need to, particularly in Scotland, in the policy areas we can be responsible for, look at and value provenance and local supplies a great deal more than we do, and put pressure on supermarkets, but not just supermarkets. Local Scottish businesses too can quite often go down the catering pack route. And if you get supplies locally, it's got less of a carbon footprint. It's more appealing for people who come to see you, many of whom have travelled by public transport, and it gives you a distinct selling point as a place and ultimately as a country. So I think we need to think laterally about all sorts of things to do with imports, exports, travel, how far things are going. I noticed that, for example, Waitrose's Highland venison actually comes from New Zealand, which, given the amount of venison available in Scotland, is rather extraordinary. But it's not fundamentally helpful. This is not all about going on holiday. It's not all about not driving V8 cars. It's actually about thinking out everything connects to everything else, and holding up good examples for us all to learn from. And we're not yet very good at either of those things.
Thank you. On the topic of everything being interconnected, the issue of the Amazon rainforest now emitting more carbon than it absorbs, and the destruction of the rainforest by successive governments in Brazil raises the question of what do developed countries owe to developing countries if we want them to safeguard global resources like the Amazon rainforest that are necessary for combating climate change, while at the same time supporting their development. Either Murray or Natasha.
I think legislation is one way that we can help address this. If we make some really strong legislative action that prevents the destruction that we're seeing, or at least a requirement to counteract what you are doing, because otherwise it's never going to reverse. These businesses aren't going to address the issue. They're going to let someone else take responsibility for it. And we do owe it to these countries, and we owe it to the Amazon for the future generations that we are able to support a planet which isn't seeing such destruction at the levels that we are at the moment. And if we don't start changing it now, where does it stop? The action needs to happen now. It needed to happen years ago. We can't turn the clock back. But if we don't start now, we aren't going to see real change. And unfortunately, no one is doing enough at the moment.
Thank you, Natasha. And with COP26 coming up in Glasgow, either of you, what is one thing that you would like to see happen in the city that could make Glasgow as a city more sustainable and support climate action? Murray?
Well, I think that Glasgow as a city is struggling with significant budget issues. But I think what I would like to see is the mass move of local authority vehicles. It's already happening, but accelerating towards electric, and also a move in the city, because still a lot of cities are still talking about traffic as if it's one thing, but to actually offer some preferential, some nudge, some incentive to electric cars and electric car drivers in the city, as well as increasing the rollout of on-street charging stations for electric cars. Because we're still looking at a situation where, in terms of electric car take-up, There's far too little. That's available for straightforward contactless charging, and too many subscription schemes, competing networks, and so forth. So we need to incentivize both public and private electric transport in the city, owned by the city, and entering the city.
Thank you. Natasha, if you had something you could change in Glasgow to improve its sustainability, what would that be?
I think better and more efficient public transport links, obviously taking it slightly wider than Glasgow. The cost of a train from Edinburgh to Glasgow is far too high, and it doesn't encourage people to use these form of transport link. So we need to make it more affordable for people to use the public transport that we see in Glasgow and wider than Glasgow, because if you aren't making it affordable for people, they aren't going to use it. So if we are trying to encourage people into using more public transport, which is more efficient and better for the environment, then we need to make it affordable so that people can actually use it. Right now, it costs nearly £30 to get a train from Edinburgh to Glasgow. So many people will not use that service and instead use private transport, use their own cars, drive. And that's where the issue lies. If people aren't going to be able to afford to use the public transport, we're missing a real opportunity there.
That's absolutely true. There really is something to think about there when it comes to peak time train tickets. When peak time is when you want also as few cars on the road as possible, because congestion leads to more emissions. So that is definitely something to think about. So moving on from that onto our next story. Boris Johnson has recently been in Scotland. He visited Glasgow and Aberdeenshire, and while he was here, he became a close contact of a person who had COVID-19 but has declined to self-isolate. As we are moving into a new stage of pandemic management, both in Scotland and England, where we are moving beyond lockdowns and into more measures that require more personal responsibility for maintaining your testing and self-isolation. Natasha, what do you think of this decision?
It's difficult because it's the latest story in different rules applying to different people depending on their position in government. And it's so difficult to ask people to comply with these rules for so long when we're seeing time and time again of the people who are making the rules not sticking to them, or a special rule applying to them. How can you tell people that they need to follow the rules, they need to isolate, they need to not see their families? All these impositions on people's lives, and then the people who are making those impositions, they don't apply to them. So how can we keep compliance up when things like this are happening? And I think the whole trip from Boris to Scotland has been detrimental. It's just another example of how so much of politics these days is clouded by sparring and point scoring. And it found Nicola Sturgeon really in a win-win position. You know, she asked to meet him. She extended the invitation when he was here, and declining it is an apparent slight on Nicola by Boris. And to compound this, he either deliberately or by a lack of understanding came to Scotland bringing up the painful history of Margaret Thatcher and her fight with the unions that led to the decimation of the mining industry throughout this country. So by making a joke of it, he only sought to alienate Scotland in the way that people feel up here about her actions at that time. And his visit seems to, by default, have strengthened the independence campaign and further detrimented the people in Scotland's views on him, the government, and with the latest news, the COVID restriction compliance as well. So a very detrimental trip by him all round, I would say.
Yes, and that's interesting bringing up what he said about Margaret Thatcher and mining communities, because, of course, we were just talking about climate change, and he made a very crass joke about her having gotten a start on the fight against climate change by closing the coal mines, which is obviously an appalling comment. Murray, as a historian, what do you think about the politics of memory involved here?
Well, I think the Prime Minister was. It's certainly a take that Mrs. Thatcher was a great advocate for climate change, though it's not one that's widely shared. I accept that. I think that's right. But what he was drawing attention to, I think, and rather it didn't work out in the way that it hit the media, was he was having a go at Keir Starmer, of course, in Scotland at the same time, saying that he would not have signed the contract for the new oil field, and was actually attacking the Labour Party for its long-standing support for the mines. I don't think that went on. That really worked, obviously, but that's what he was trying to do. I mean, the politics of memory, Thatcherism it remains an important part of memory in Scotland, but it is getting longer and longer ago, and I think it's important not to be marred. And he was deliberately. I think there's an element of deliberate annoyance, and one of the reasons for that is that I think the Prime Minister is quite confident that Scots ultimately will not choose to be independent of the UK. And and he often seeks to emphasise that view by actually being willfully slightly provocative, and also by quite often talking about how he's got a respect agenda towards Scotland and the Scottish Parliament, and actually doing exactly the opposite when it comes to what he does rather than what he tells the official media outlets are interviewing. I think that other government ministers have that line of approach as well. So this is a very interesting time, but fundamentally, and having although it's a long time ago, having the pleasure of knowing the Prime Minister personally, fundamentally, I think that he doesn't value people who don't stand up for themselves, and he's pretty confident the Scots won't stand up for themselves, and that I think is at the root of the way he approaches his relations with Scotland.
Thank you. You've mentioned that Keir Starmer was, of course, in Scotland around the same time, and has not really gotten the media attention that Boris Johnson has. Now, with Scotland having previously been quite heavily Labour voting, it's always interesting to see how the current UK Labour Party's leader doesn't receive very much attention up here. And Natasha, do you want to comment on that? Oh, I think we've lost Natasha.
Well, I'll just
jump in.
What are you getting back? I'll stand in a reciprocal action for earlier on and say I think one of the reasons. Let's be absolutely frank, because of course there's the interview about how Scotland shouldn't have another independence referendum. One of the reasons that he doesn't get any attention is because nobody can tell any difference from the point of view of the major questions facing Scotland between what he says and what the Conservative government says. It's like, it's since Meikle Gove recently said, if it's the settled will of the Scottish people, there should be another independence referendum. And Keir Starmer says independence referendum is up to the Scottish people, but it isn't the right time. One would defy anyone to put, as people used to say, a sheet of cigarette paper between those two positions. And what that lack of attention on the Labour leader tells us is how far Labour have lost their way in Scotland by not taking the opportunity devolution presented to be a patriotic Scottish party who believed in the Union. And the attempts to do that in the early years of devolution, particularly those of Henry McLeish, foundered. And since particularly the 2014 referendum campaign, Labour have allowed themselves to double down on what's fundamentally a conservative position. And as with Brexit, the Labour Party are fine that when you double down on a conservative position, people still trust the Conservatives more to deliver it because they're the originators of it, most closely identified with it. So there aren't a lot of votes for Labour in the Union. There are people who've left Labour to vote Conservative because they believe in the Union. And a lot of Labour MSPs who lost their seats in 2011 and MPs in the years following 2015 and so forth will say that if you ask them. They know that some of their votes have gone to the Tories because they behaved in a way which is identical to the Tories, but the Tories are, the original people who really believe in the Union. So we better trust them and vote for them. And that's where Labour have put themselves. They didn't have to put themselves there, but that's what they've been putting themselves for years.
Thank you. And speaking of the Tories being the people who are very strong on the union. It has recently emerged that the UK government has spent £168,000 on union flags in the last 2 years. This seems to be part of an increase in branding services as belonging to the UK. Would you like to comment on that, Murray?
Well, I don't actually think it's. I mean, it's obviously quite a lot of money, but it's not that much money in government spend. And my concern about commenting on it negatively would be that the next thing is how much has been spent on saltires, or how much has been spent. Flags are obviously being used by the UK government to ban the UK in Scotland. And once again, this is very, very like the Prime Minister. The question is how much are people prepared to accept it? And his view is they just will.
Yes. Thank you. Welcome back, Natasha. So speaking of the brand then, we are wrapping up the Olympics. The closing ceremony is today. And there's been sort of talk about the branding of Team GB as well, and how that sort of has sort of strengthened the team identity or not. Would either of you like to comment on the sort of Team GB branding?
Natasha?
Natasha?
I think what's been really encouraging this year is, yes, while we're still under Team GB and under the union flag, what we are seeing is an increase in Scots winning medals, which is what is brilliant from a Scottish perspective. 11 Scots coming home with medals from this Olympics, which is really incredible, particularly when you take into consideration the difficulties surrounding the Olympics, the circumstances, COVID, the travelling. It's great that we have such a strong team within the Team GB squad, such a strong Scottish team who have represented the country and GB well and are coming home with a great medal haul. For me, it's particularly encouraging to see the amount of female athletes who are succeeding at the Olympics. And it's encouraging to see how much of the team was made up of female athletes. We took more Scottish people than we expected as part of Team GB, and 60% of the Scots in Tokyo were female, which represents a significant milestone in the modern makeup of Team Scotland within Team GB, and it's reflective of the growth in women's sport over the years. And that's really down to funding. And it's something that's so important to sport, but particularly to female sport, because increased funding means that the numbers we can send will grow, and that'll encourage future growth as well. One of our athletes, Ailey Doyle, said that for her, when she was growing up as an athlete, in Team GB, if you like, the only female athlete for her to look up to in the athletic sphere was Lee McConnell. And now this generation coming through have a wide range of Scottish female athletes who are out there succeeding and encouraging the next generation. So we can only continue to see growth through increased participation, increased inspiration, but we need to match that with increased funding and focus on women's sport as well.
Mm-hmm. It's been incredible with some of the new sports added to the Olympics this year. Looking at the medal winners in women's skateboarding, it's hard to actually say women's because they're 12 and 13-year-old girls. But what do you think of the competitors being so young? Is that possibly worrying to see 12 and 13-year-olds having to compete on the international stage, or is it an inspiration to younger girls to see that there are, young teenagers out there winning medals in these sports that women, possibly they're so young because women didn't have access to skateboarding in the past?
It's an incredible experience for these girls and women, and I think it's fantastic to see the young girls succeeding so well in the skateboarding. I think it's clearly a sport that suits a younger generation. We're seeing that with the age and the medalists, the age of the competitors. And of course, it must be a significant amount of pressure on very young shoulders. But from the images we're seeing, these are young girls who are doing what they love. And if that encourages other young girls who are watching it, not only to take up skateboarding, but to take up any sport that they love and that they are passionate about. And if they see these young girls who are just like them competing on a stage like the Olympics, that helps encourage them that anything is possible if they continue to pursue and to commit to something that they enjoy. So whatever sport it is, it doesn't need to be skateboarding. If they can take any sort of inspiration and encouragement from these young girls winning medals, then I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. These these Olympics have been notable for the amount of discussion about athlete mental health that have happened. Again, particularly with women athletes, I'm thinking of Simone Biles and her sort of withdrawal from most of the gymnastics competition, but also her incredible openness about her training process and what has gone into her being able to come back for the beam competition. I was wondering if you'd like to comment on athlete mental health, just in terms of what goes into being under that amount of scrutiny and having all those hopes on their shoulders.
Yes, I think one thing that's particularly positive is that we're now talking about it. We've got people like Simone Biles coming out and being very open and honest about it. The Olympic Games and these sports that they are taking part in is an incredible feat in terms of physical strength and physical health. And we look towards that more and more, but we forget about the mental strain that these athletes must be under to have committed so much of their life and dedicated it to being at the Olympics. I don't think we can fully appreciate until you've been in their position how mentally tough that must be. And for her to be so open and honest can only encourage other people who are feeling the same. I think as a society, even out with sport, it is something that we are taking strides towards dealing with more, but there is so much more to be done. And if other young girls, not just young athletes or other young people in general, can look at Simone Biles and think, she is incredible. She is one of the best ever at what she does. If she can take a step back and say, my mental health isn't very good right now, and what I'm going to do is what I need to do to protect that. If other people can see her doing that, then that will encourage more people to talk about it. And the more people that talk about it, the more that we can deal with it. Because it's no secret that mental health is another pandemic in this country that we need to fix. And I think there is absolutely nothing wrong with these athletes talking about it and recognizing it and dealing with it. And what we absolutely don't need is commentators in the media, on news channels, talking disparagingly about Simone as if she has to get on with it, suck it up and deal with it is not the attitude that we need when we're dealing with mental health. And I think we need to try and do what we can to eliminate that sort of commentary and to respect her for what she has chosen to do, which is ultimately protecting herself and protecting her mental health. So I think all credit to her for doing that.
Right. Thank you. And speaking of that intersection between the media and the mental health of athletes, there have been sort of some media attacks on athletes, both for espousing political views. I'm thinking of the American shot putter Raven Saunders and the way the media and the IOC have responded to her political protest on the podium, but also in terms of how LGBTQ athletes have been treated, with the media environment being so global now, and the Russian media attacks on LGBTQ athletes, including Tom Daley, who they referred to as a British homosexual as opposed to a normal guy like the Russian competitor, and attacked him for raising a child with his partner. I was wondering if either of you would like to comment about the sort of international media. Murray?
Well, I mean, I'd say it's what you expect. I mean, the world is quite tribal and fragmented. There are many much better funded media outlets than there were 20, 30 years ago, in countries with very much more what were considered in the West to be old-fashioned or conservative views about human gender and mental health and various other things than there used to be. And so this is natural, not that it's positive, but it is inevitable in the circumstances we're in. I mean, that sport is, as has been observed many times, war by other means, and it's war by much better means than war itself. But the elements of jingoism, judgmentalism, nationalism are not absent from sport. And I think that the important thing that Natasha has raised in that context is that actually the example, the inspiration that successful sports women and men can be to people who are not yet in that position or who are aspiring to that position, or to population more generally, is what is important about success in sports, and not so much the flag. We expect people to cheer on their own teams. We expect them to cheer on the people from their own country, but overmuch use of jingoism, particularly, for example, focusing on, as television does more than it did in the 70s or 80s, on members of your own national team who've lost rather than those who've actually won an event. That kind of thing is less helpful than the inspiration and example provided by the individual sports people concerned.
Thank you. And in terms of our larger conversation about climate change and sustainability and travel and large scale events like the Olympics, Murray, what do you think the future holds for the Olympics with the massive amounts of resources that go into constructing new sports facilities and basically entire small cities every 2 years between the Summer and Winter Olympics in new locations? And how do you think this is going to play out in future?
Right. Well, I mean, obviously the Olympics have an impact on climate change. It's not enormous by the standards of the routine impacts, but it's very much there. In terms of the cost and so on of hosting them, I think only one Olympics, as far as I'm aware, Los Angeles, actually paid off in terms of the balance between expenditure and income. One of the interesting things is that when you see huge amounts of money expended on the Olympics, the 16 billion, for example, in London in 2012, you often get an argument from politicians up front that this will create a legacy which will be an economic benefit, a net economic benefit in the longer run. But after the Olympics, you very rarely get these same politicians commissioning economic impact assessments, because actually the Olympics always cost more, or nearly always cost more, than they ever deliver an economic benefit. And that, I think, is a real question in terms of sustainability. It's more perhaps even than than emissions getting to the Olympics themselves. It is that actually people are choosing to spend very large sums of money on what's basically an exercise in national pride, which has got limited long-term economic value and very much adverse immediate value for sustainability. So that's the question. I mean, I think the point is that myself, I favor major international sporting events, possibly with the advent of the World Championships, as well as the Olympics, with the Commonwealth Games and the European Championships. We've got to a stage where there are rather a lot of them. But I do, because they do bring countries together despite all the jingoism, and they are very important platforms for athletes globally. You can't do them by Zoom, that's for certain. But at the same time, I think we need to be honest that this is a cost, an immediate cost to sustainability in terms of travel, but actually a longer term cost, because it means spending money which will never be recovered on things which actually are counterweight or countervailing against the overall sustainability agenda. So if we do them, and we should do them, we should look at the price, the social, the sustainable, the economic price honestly, and not tell ourselves flag-wrapped stories about how they're going to generate economic benefit when the real evidence is that they almost never do.
Mm-hmm. What do we think that we could do to counteract that? Something like a permanent site that countries could kind of take turns hosting, or something like that. Natasha, do you have any thoughts?
I think if we're going to start cancelling or addressing large-scale events like the Olympics on the basis that it has a detrimental impact on climate and sustainability, there would be a very long list of things that couldn't go ahead under that sphere. I think we have to look at the Olympics as being beneficial in a wider sense. Yes, the travel, the construction, the associated impact that it has on the climate, of course it's going to be detrimental, but like we've already touched on, that is a small blot in the landscape of a much, much bigger issue. And I think that the Olympics and sport in general has so many positive messages that it gives out. I think for women, the role of sport in driving gender equality, for improving the health and well-being of girls and women in the country is so important. And one thing that we see in some of the work that I do is we see increased participation of women and girls in sport, matching the increase in visibility. So the more that they see these women competing and achieving in sport, the more that they are likely to take it up themselves, and the general well-being mentally, physically improves. And the role of sport in addressing gender inequality in the country is so massively important. So yes, I am sure that the Olympics and other wider sporting events do have detrimental impact in terms of society and sustainability, and not society, sustainability, and the impact on the climate. Yes, of course that's going to be there. But let's look at the positive outcomes that it gives and the role it brings in terms of positive outcomes to society. I think that more than negates the effect of the detriment to the climate.
If I
Thank
might
you.
just
Yep.
cut in here, I'd have to say that we do have some areas of disagreement there, Natasha. I think it's great, the examples that people give, and I support major sporting events of this kind. But if we are going to do more, we have to do things in the bits that we like, as well as the bits that we think other people should do. And one of the things I would say here is that, for example, the Olympics cost a great deal more than the Commonwealth Games. And one of the reasons it costs more is its scale. But one of the other reasons is that it's a flag event, that a new country gets it and they build new material and new infrastructure, and it's all expensive and it all doesn't make its money back. And what we don't do is actually think about the countries which have recent Olympic facilities and give it to them again, which is kind of giving them a double bite of the cherry, but actually might make the Olympic movement more economically sustainable and make it less bound up with a process, and it's not the sole event like this, of national bidding and counter bidding to get the games, as to get the World Cup or to get the Commonwealth Games. All these things are actually fundamentally jingoistic rather than sports centered. And we've got a lot of facilities which are not being properly used across the world because cities that have won the games or our games before don't get the value out of them, and they're never used again while during their lifespan, because somebody else has got to host the games and therefore build a whole load of new stuff.
There's certainly elements that we can address in that, and of course, when all that infrastructure is built, if you're talking about the villages that host the athletes, the stadiums that might need to be constructed, I think it is important within that we do make sure that they are then utilised for another purpose, and that those construction efforts and the infrastructure haven't went to waste, if you like. So I think I agree with you on that point, that it's important that we aren't losing the impact of this, and we are using these again for a future purpose. But what you've said there in terms of the countries bidding for this, it's all financial. It is buying the games, if you like. It's buying the World Cup. It's buying the right to be the host city and to have everyone come to your city. And of course that is financial, and we aren't seeing an end to that anytime soon, I don't think.
No, but we could spend the money more wisely. That's my point.
Spirited debate. Thank you both. We're drawing near the end of your time. So just a lighter question. I'll go first to Murray and then to Natasha. In an independent Scotland, what would you hope to see from our Olympic team?
Well, I think one of the things I would say is that the current Scottish Olympians do benefit from the spending at UK level as well as the Scottish level. So you'd have to be serious about the infrastructure you put in. But Scotland has won almost a quarter of the medals this time round that the whole team GB has won. And so I think that there's no question with achievements like Laura Muir's, historic achievements like Laura Muir's to celebrate, that Scottish international athletics starts from a very strong position in any future independent competition for the country in the Olympics.
Thank you. Natasha?
I would like to see increased funding given to women in sport and the organisations that support women in sport. At the moment, there is a disparity in terms of the funding that is given to the male and female athletes. And we've all read the stories from the Olympics about athletes that have had from Great Britain and from Scotland who have had to crowdfund their way to these Olympic Games. And more often than not, it is the women that have to do this. So I want to see more funding given to grassroots levels of sport in Scotland so that we can help these young girls and women become the next Olympians, become the next Laura Muirs, the next Katie Archibalds, the next Anna Burnett's. If we start the funding at a young age and make sure that the girls have access to these sports, a wide variety of sports, we're seeing sailing, hockey, swimming, athletics. If we start the funding for these women and girls at a young age, we'll start to see the benefits of that when they become older, and we can increase the number of women that we are sending to the Olympics. But with so many things, it all starts with the funding.
Great. Thank you. Well, that was this week's The Full Scottish. Thank you, Murray and Natasha, and thank you to you at home. At Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on your donations to make our programs. If you already contribute, we'd like to thank you, and if you'd like to subscribe, you can find the link below. If you'd like to work with us to make programs like this, we are always looking for volunteers. You can see the contact details on the screen below. Thank you to our guests, and we'll see you next time.